The cold metal stock of the Winchester rifle felt like a bar of ice pressed against Nathaniel's bony shoulder, a stark contrast to the fire of terror burning in his stomach. He was 12 years old, thin and wiry from years of scavenging, and the weapon was nearly as tall as he was, its weight a constant, trembling burden. Across the small clearing, the two men had stopped their grim work, their shovels frozen mid-air. One, a brute with a tangled red beard, stared at him with a look of pure disbelief that was slowly melting into cruel amusement. The other, leaner and more watchful, simply narrowed his eyes. In the shallow grave between them, a woman with a gag in her mouth looked from the men to Nathaniel, her eyes wide with a terror that threatened to swallow him whole. His own voice, when it came out, was a reedy thing, cracking with fear yet somehow firm as he spoke the two words that would change everything. "Let her go." The forest held its breath, waiting to see if a boy could truly stand against monsters. If this single, heart-stopping moment has already pulled you into Nathaniel's world, I'd be truly grateful if you would let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. Your support, whether it's a simple like on the story or a subscription to the channel, is what allows these narratives to be told. It helps build a community of people who appreciate the power of a story that unfolds one word at a time, and I promise you, the journey that led to this impossible standoff is one you will want to see through to the very end. The reasons behind this boy's courage are more profound than you can possibly imagine, and the story of how he got here is just beginning. It's a tale of loss, survival, and a promise made to a ghost. But to understand how a child who had spent 3 years learning to be invisible found the strength to make himself the most visible person in this deadly clearing, we have to go back. We must travel back in time, not just by minutes, but by years. This moment of incredible bravery was not born from sudden impulse. It was forged in the crushing silence of abandonment and the harsh lessons of survival in the Montana Territory of 1887. To comprehend why a starving orphan would risk his own meager existence for a complete stranger, we must return to the day his world of structure and safety collapsed 3 years prior, when his gold prospector father vanished into the mountains, leaving him utterly and completely alone with nothing but the fading echo of his father's lessons on what it truly meant to be a man of character. 3 years earlier, Nathaniel Holloway was 9 years old. His world was not a forest clearing filled with danger, but a small, sturdy cabin nestled in the foothills of the Elkhorn Mountains, a world that smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and his father's pipe tobacco. The collapse did not come with a crash, but with a profound and terrifying silence. His father, Ezekiel Holloway, a man whose hands were as skilled with a rifle as they were with a gold pan, had walked into the mountains one Tuesday morning, promising to be back by Saturday with supplies and, if luck was with them, a pouch heavy with color. Saturday came and went, then a week, then a month. The silence in the cabin grew, swelling to fill every corner, smothering the boy's hope until all that remained was the cold, hard certainty of being left behind. He was alone, the last echo of his father's booming laugh having long since faded into the indifferent whisper of the wind through the pines. The first winter was a brutal teacher. The cold was not just in the air, it seeped through the chinks in the cabin walls and settled deep in his bones, a permanent chill that food and fire could only temporarily hold at bay. He survived on the meager stores his father had left, supplementing them with the snares and traps Ezekiel had taught him to set. He remembered his father's voice, a low and steady guide in his memory, explaining how to read the tracks of a snowshoe hare, how to find the sunny side of a slope, where the bitter root might still be dug from the frozen ground. Each rabbit he caught, each root he unearthed, was a small, desperate victory against the encroaching wilderness that had swallowed his father whole. He was no longer a boy waiting, but a creature surviving, his grief frozen into a quiet, grim determination. The world had become a simple, binary equation, find food or perish. When spring finally broke the mountain's icy grip, Nathaniel made a decision. The cabin, once a symbol of safety and home, had become a tomb of memories, a monument to his abandonment. He packed what little he could carry, a tinderbox, his father's hunting knife, and a worn leather-bound copy of Shakespeare his mother had owned, and walked out, not looking back. He headed east, toward the distant smoke that marked the city of Helena. He imagined it as a place of warmth and noise, a place where a boy could find work, where he might hear news of his father, where he couldn't possibly be as alone as he was in the vast, silent mountains. The reality was a different kind of cold. Helena was a city of strangers, a bustling, chaotic world of mud-caked streets and hurried footsteps, where a solitary child was less than a ghost. He was simply unseen, an inconvenient shadow in the corner of a prosperous world. His life in the territorial capital settled into a grueling and predictable rhythm. Mornings were spent haunting the back alleys of the grand hotels and saloons on Last Chance Gulch, his small, nimble fingers sifting through the refuse for anything edible. He learned the schedules of the kitchen staff, the exact moment a bucket of potato peels or a half-eaten loaf of bread would be tossed out. The smell of garbage and stale beer became the scent of his survival. Afternoons were for searching for odd jobs, his voice barely a whisper as he offered to sweep storefronts, carry water, or muck out a stable for a few cents. The coins were precious, each one a tiny shield against the gnawing hunger in his belly. He learned that the world was not cruel in an active sense. It was worse. It was indifferent. It simply did not care if he lived or died. This profound indifference taught him the art of invisibility. He learned to walk with his shoulders hunched and his eyes down, to move along the edges of walls, to make his presence so small and insignificant that he could slip through the bustling town without drawing a single glance. It was a skill honed by necessity, a defense mechanism against a world that saw an orphan as either a nuisance or an opportunity for exploitation. He became a master of silence, his footsteps light on the boardwalks, his breathing shallow when hiding in a darkened stable for the night. This self-effacement became his armor, a way to navigate the dangers of a world without a protector. He did not know it then, but this training in becoming unseen was a dress rehearsal, preparing him for a moment when moving silently through the woods would mean the difference between life and death. In the deepest, coldest nights, huddled under a threadbare blanket in some forgotten corner of the town, he would allow himself to remember. He would conjure the image of his father, not as a ghost in the mountains, but as a living, breathing man. He remembered the calloused warmth of his father's hand on his shoulder, teaching him how to hold the old Winchester, how to brace for the kick, how to lead a moving target. He could almost feel the weight of that hand, a phantom pressure that was both a comfort and an ache. He remembered sitting by the fire, his father's voice filling the small cabin as he spoke of honor and duty, of the unseen lines that connected every person. These memories were a double-edged sword, a painful reminder of everything he had lost, but also the only true warmth he had left. The lessons were more than just memories of actions. They were a moral architecture built inside him. "A man's character, Nate," his father would say, his voice serious as he cleaned his rifle by the firelight, "is the only thing he truly owns. Gold can be lost, land can be taken, but what you are on the inside, that's yours forever." Ezekiel Holloway spoke of courage not as the absence of fear, but as the act of doing what was right even when your knees were shaking. He taught him that a man who stands by and watches injustice is a partner to it, that a promise made was a debt that must be paid. These were not abstract concepts to Nathaniel. They were the last will and testament of the man he worshipped, a code of conduct that he recited to himself in the dark like a prayer. There were fleeting moments of grace, tiny cracks of light in the oppressive grey of his existence. Sometimes it was the discovery of a discarded apple, its skin bruised, but its flesh sweet and crisp, a burst of flavor in a world of bland survival. Other times, it was the kindness of a stranger, a baker's wife who would accidentally drop a warm roll near where he was sitting, her eyes telling him it was for him without a word being spoken. Once, he found a nickel half buried in the mud and spent it on a small piece of chocolate, letting it melt on his tongue so slowly that the taste lasted for an entire afternoon. These instances were rare, but they were vital. They were proof that the world was not entirely made of stone, that small pockets of warmth and sweetness could still exist, and they fueled his will to see another sunrise. 3 years of this life had chiseled him into a creature of pure function. He was 12 now, but his frame was that of a much younger boy, all sharp angles and jutting bones, a testament to his constant battle with hunger. His clothes were a patchwork of found items, worn thin and perpetually coated in a layer of dust and grime. But it was his eyes that told the true story. They were his father's eyes, a deep and steady grey, but they held the ancient, weary watchfulness of a man who had seen too much. They rarely blinked, constantly scanning his surroundings, assessing threats, looking for opportunities. They were the eyes of a hunter, not of game, but of survival itself, and they held a quiet intensity that would have unsettled any adult who bothered to look long enough to notice. He carried only one object that connected him to his past, a small flat river stone his father had given him years ago. It was perfectly smooth, a deep grey with a single white line running through its centre. "That's your lifeline, son," his father had told him, closing the boy's small hand around it. "When you feel lost, you hold on to that, and remember which way is true." Nathaniel kept it in his pocket always. The stone's cool, solid weight against his palm was a constant, tangible reminder of his father's presence. It was his compass, not for navigating the wilderness of the mountains, but for navigating the much more treacherous wilderness of men. It was a link to the code he was meant to live by, a silent promise to the ghost he still spoke to in his heart. His greatest fear was not starvation or the brutal Montana winter. It was the terror of disappearing. He had seen it happen. Men would drift into Helena, their hopes high, and a few months later they would be gone. No one marking their passage, no one asking where they went. He was terrified that he would one day simply cease to be, that his own small, difficult life would be erased as completely as his father's had been. To be forgotten was to him a fate worse than death. It was this fear that drove him to hold so tightly to his father's lessons, because if he could live as the man his father wanted him to be, then a part of Ezekiel Holloway would still exist in the world. His own life was a vessel for his father's legacy. Occasionally, this internal code would manifest in small, seemingly insignificant actions. He would leave a portion of a scavenged meal for a stray dog, its ribs as prominent as his own. He would spend his last penny to buy a box of matches for an old woman struggling to light her pipe with trembling hands. These were not logical acts for someone living on the absolute margin of survival. They were acts of defiance. They were a declaration to the indifferent world, and to himself, that the hardship had not broken him. It was a quiet insistence that his father's son was still alive, that the lessons of empathy and duty had taken root, even in the most barren soil of his existence. And so, on that crisp Tuesday afternoon, in September of 1887, Nathaniel was not just a hungry orphan cutting through the woods. He was the sum of these 3 years of hardship and a lifetime of his father's teachings. He was a boy who knew the profound weight of loss, the sharp sting of indifference, and the quiet strength of a promise. He had learned to be invisible, to survive on nothing, and to expect even less. But inside his thin chest, behind the wall of practiced invisibility, the heart of his father's son was still beating, waiting for a moment when doing the right thing was the only thing that mattered. He was walking toward the next town, looking for a day's labor. But he was unknowingly walking toward his destiny, toward a choice that would prove whether he was just a survivor or a man of character. The normalcy of that Tuesday afternoon was shattered not by a sound, but by its quality. For 3 years, Nathaniel had learned the language of the forest, the chatter of squirrels, the sigh of wind through pine boughs, the distant cry of a hawk. The sounds he heard now were different. They were human voices, sharp and angry, a discordant tear in the fabric of the wilderness. They were accompanied by a rhythmic, heavy thudding, a sound like a giant, irregular heartbeat. He froze, his survival instincts screaming at him. Human sounds in a place this remote meant trouble, a disruption to the careful, invisible life he had built. His first impulse was to melt back into the trees, to become just another shadow. But a morbid and powerful curiosity pulled him forward, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He moved from his path, his worn boots making no sound on the thick carpet of pine needles as he crept toward the source of the disturbance. He moved with the practiced stealth of a hunter, keeping low to the ground, using the dense undergrowth and the thick trunks of ponderosa pines as cover. The voices grew clearer, laced with a cruelty that made the hairs on his arms stand up. The thudding stopped and was replaced by the grating scrape of a shovel against rock and soil. He could distinguish 2 separate male voices now, one a low grumble, the other a higher, more agitated rasp. A cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. This was not a trapper checking a line or a prospector digging for a claim. This was something wrong, something secret and violent. He reached a fallen log overgrown with moss and ferns, a perfect vantage point. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of the angry voices. He took a slow, silent breath and carefully parted the fronds to look into the clearing beyond. The scene that met his eyes was a tableau from a nightmare. So stark and brutal it seemed unreal. Two men stood beside a freshly dug, shallow pit in the reddish earth. He recognized them instantly from a faded wanted poster nailed to the wall of the Helena Marshal's office. The Taggart brothers, Jedediah and Silas, wanted for a string of violent stagecoach robberies. Jedediah, the older and larger of the two, had a tangled red beard and eyes like chips of cold granite. Silas was leaner, a nervous energy radiating from him as he clutched the shovel. But it was the third person in the clearing that made Nathaniel's breath catch in his throat. A woman, her hands bound behind her back and a dirty gag stuffed in her mouth, was on her knees at the edge of the grave. Her dress was torn, and her face was pale with a terror so profound it felt like a physical blow. He watched, paralyzed, as Jedediah grabbed the woman by the arm and shoved her forward. She stumbled, catching herself just before falling into the pit. Her eyes, wide and pleading, scanned the silent trees, a desperate final search for a savior that wasn't there. Nathaniel could see the frantic rise and fall of her chest, could almost hear the muffled sobs behind the gag. She was not a name or a person to him, not yet. She was the physical embodiment of ultimate vulnerability, a human being at the complete mercy of monsters. The sight resonated with a deep and terrible familiarity. He knew what it felt like to be helpless, to be alone against a world that did not care. The indifference of the forest, the silent witness of the trees, felt like a mirror of the indifference he had faced every day for the past 3 years. Then the words came, sharp and clear, confirming the horror of the scene. Her father had his chance, Jedediah Taggart growled, his voice a low rumble of pure menace. The judge wanted to play hero, refused to pay. Now he can bury what's left of his precious Caroline. The name hung in the air, a final, tragic detail. Silas, shifting his weight nervously, glanced around the woods. "Let's just get it done, Jed. I don't like it out here." Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Nobody's out here but us and the worms. She's the last loose end. We put her in the ground, and nobody ever connects us to the Ashford kidnapping. No witness, no crime." The threat was no longer implied. It was spoken, a death sentence delivered in the quiet of the Montana wilderness. They were burying their only witness. A wave of ice-cold terror washed over Nathaniel. He was a witness. He had seen them. He had heard their names. The same logic that condemned the woman now applied to him. If they found him, if they saw even a flicker of movement behind this log, his small, hard-won life would end here, his body tossed into the same shallow grave. The imperative to survive, the instinct that had kept him alive for 1,000 lonely days and nights, screamed at him to run. It was a physical urge, a coiling in his muscles to turn and flee, to disappear back into the anonymity of the woods and the uncaring streets of the next town. He could be gone in seconds. They would never know he was here. He could live. He could eat tomorrow. He just had to stand up and walk away, leaving the woman to her fate. But as the instinct to flee screamed, a quieter, deeper voice spoke in his mind. It was his father's voice, as clear as if Ezekiel Holloway was standing right beside him. "A man's character, Nate, is the only thing he truly owns." He saw his father's face, earnest and serious, in the flickering firelight of their old cabin. There are moments when you have to choose what kind of man you're going to be. A man who sees evil and flees is worse than the man who does evil, because he gives that evil permission to exist. The memory was not a gentle comfort. It was a heavy, unyielding weight. To run would be to betray the only thing he had left of his father, his teachings. It would mean that the last 3 years of starvation and loneliness had successfully burned away the core of who he was supposed to be. He forced himself to think, to assess the situation with the cold logic his father had taught him for tracking game. The nearest town was miles away. The law, a marshal or a sheriff, was an entire day's ride, if he could even find one. There was no help to be summoned. There was no time. He could see Silas raising the shovel again, his intent clear. The decision was not between getting help and running away. It was simpler and more terrible than that. The choice was between acting now alone or doing nothing. The forest offered no third option. The world had presented him with an impossible test, and the only resources he had were the tattered clothes on his back and a dead man's principles. The finality of the moment arrived as Jedediah, with a grunt of effort, shoved Caroline Ashford hard. She lost her balance and tumbled awkwardly into the shallow grave, landing with a soft thud. She looked up, her eyes filled with a horror that was beyond pleading, a look of pure, soul-shattering despair. Silas stepped forward to the edge of the pit and lifted his shovel high, the blade dark with clumps of fresh earth. That single, terrible motion broke through Nathaniel's fear. It was no longer a potential event. It was happening. The first scoop of dirt was about to fall, the first handful of a living burial. In that instant, the boy who had learned to be invisible, the orphan who had mastered the art of survival by expecting nothing and mattering to no one, knew he could not run. The world had forgotten him, but he could not forget the lessons of the one person who had ever truly seen him. The world contracted to the space between the raised shovel and the woman in the grave. In that sliver of time, Nathaniel's mind became a battlefield. One part of him, the part that had learned to survive for 3 years, screamed with a primal, undeniable force. It was the voice of hunger, of cold nights, of the crushing loneliness that had become his only companion. It screamed at him to run, to turn his back and melt into the trees, to live to see another sunrise, to find another meal. This was not his fight. The world had never fought for him, and he owed it nothing. To interfere was to invite the very death he had so skillfully dodged for 1,000 days. It was a simple, brutal calculus of self-preservation, the only math that had mattered since his father vanished, his muscles tensed, his body preparing to obey the command to flee and forget. But another voice, quieter, yet infinitely heavier, rose to meet the scream of survival. It was his father's voice, not a memory but a living presence inside him, a foundational pillar of his soul. It spoke of character, of the lines that separate men from beasts, of the sacred duty to stand against evil, not as a hero but simply as a man. To run now would be to kill the last most important part of his father that still lived. It would be an admission that the hardship had won, that the indifference of the world had successfully scoured him clean of everything Ezekiel Holloway had tried to build. In that frozen moment, as Silas Taggart's muscles bunched to begin the final terrible swing, Nathaniel Holloway made a choice. He chose his father's ghost over his own life. The boy who survived would die, so the man his father raised could be born. The decision, once made, was like a switch being thrown. The paralyzing terror did not vanish, but it was forced into the background, replaced by a cold, sharp focus he hadn't felt since he last tracked a buck with his father. His eyes, which had been locked on the horror in the grave, now darted around the clearing, not as a frightened child looking for an escape, but as a hunter assessing the terrain. He catalogued every detail, the distance between the trees, the density of the undergrowth, the way the light fell through the canopy. And then he saw it. 50 yards away, tethered loosely to a low-hanging pine branch, were the Taggart's horses. They shifted nervously, their ears twitching, and hanging from the horn of one of the saddles, gleaming dully in the filtered sunlight, was a Winchester rifle. It was a lifeline, a terrible and beautiful opportunity that made his heart leap with a mixture of hope and dread. A plan, desperate and born of pure instinct, exploded into his mind. It was a simple, suicidal sequence of movements. He would have to crawl, using the fallen log and the thick ferns for initial cover, then slip between the ponderosa pines to reach the horses. He would need to be silent, a ghost in the undergrowth, his movements as fluid and unnoticeable as a whisper of wind. He mentally traced the path, imagining the feel of the pine needles and damp earth under his hands and knees. He estimated the time he had, seconds, maybe a minute at most, before the brothers finished their grim work. There was no room for error, no chance for a second attempt. The plan was a single: fragile thread hanging over a chasm of certain death, and his only tools were the lessons his father had taught him about moving through the wild without a sound. He could feel the tremor starting in his hands, a violent shaking that threatened to betray him. Fear was a physical thing now, a poison in his blood making his limbs weak and his breath catch in his throat. He fumbled in his worn pocket, his fingers closing around the small, smooth riverstone his father had given him. He squeezed it hard, its cold, solid reality a desperate anchor in the storm of his terror. He focused on the single white line running through its center, the lifeline his father had spoken of. He drew a ragged breath, then another, forcing the air deep into his lungs, fighting to control the shaking. The stone did not make him brave, but it reminded him of the man who had been, the man whose courage he was now trying to borrow. It was a tangible piece of his father's strength, a final gift for this impossible moment. Taking one last searing look at the clearing, he burned the image into his mind. Jedediah Taggart had turned his back for a moment to retrieve a water skin, his posture relaxed and arrogant. Silas still stood over the grave, the shovel held aloft, hesitating for a moment as if gathering his resolve. And in the pit, the woman, Caroline, had stopped struggling. She was still, her eyes looking up at the sky, a look of profound and heartbreaking resignation on her face. She had given up. That single silent surrender was the final push Nathaniel needed. It was a confirmation that he was her only hope, that the world had presented him with a moment where his small, insignificant life could intersect with another's and change its course entirely. There was no one else coming, there was only him. With a final silent prayer to a father he hoped was listening, he began to move. The transition from stillness to motion was the most difficult part, a physical breaking of the spell of fear. He slid from behind the log, his body low to the ground, his thin frame an asset as he pressed himself into the dirt and ferns. In that instant, he said a quiet goodbye to the boy he had been. He was leaving behind the safety of invisibility, the shield of being unnoticed. To move toward that rifle was to step into the world, to make himself visible, to declare his existence in the most dangerous way imaginable. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he could never go back. The path ahead led to either a new life or no life at all. The forest floor was a landscape of sound and texture, every crackle of a dry leaf, every scrape of a twig against his worn trousers, sounded like a thunderclap in his ears. He moved with a slowness that was agonizing, placing each hand and knee with the deliberate care his father had taught him for stalking deer. All the skills he had honed over 3 years to scavenge and hide were now being used for a purpose he could never have imagined. He was no longer a creature of flight, but one of fight. The world had narrowed to this single desperate task, to cross the 50 yards of open forest, to take the weapon, and to face the monsters. He was just a boy, hungry and terrified, but as he crawled through the pine needles, he was also the living embodiment of his father's final, most important lesson. The crawl was an eternity measured in heartbeats. Nathaniel pressed his body into the damp earth, the scent of pine needles and decaying leaves filling his nostrils. Each movement was a calculated risk, a deliberate placement of a hand or a knee to avoid the snap of a dry twig. The fabric of his worn trousers scraped against the rough ground, a sound that seemed deafening in the charged silence of the woods. He was acutely aware of his own breathing, a ragged, shallow rhythm he fought to control, convinced that the Taggart brothers could hear the frantic drumming in his chest from 100 yards away. Fear was a physical weight, pressing down on his back, urging him to flatten himself into the soil and disappear forever. But for every inch he covered, his father's words echoed in his mind. A relentless counterforce to the terror that threatened to root him to the spot, a ghost pushing him forward through the undergrowth. He reached a dense patch of ferns, their cool, wet fronds brushing against his face like a spectral hand. He paused here, hidden in the green shadows, forcing himself to take a slow, deep breath that shuddered on its way out. The world seemed to tilt, the trees swaying dizzily above him. He could hear the low murmur of the Taggarts' voices again, indistinct words that carried on the breeze, a casual, cruel sound that reminded him of the seconds ticking away. The woman was still in the grave. The shovel was still in Silas's hands. The sound of their voices, so calm and ordinary in the face of such horror, was like a splash of ice water, snapping him out of his momentary paralysis. He could not afford to rest. He could not afford to hesitate. He pushed the ferns aside and continued his agonizingly slow journey, the dampness seeping through the knees of his pants, a cold reminder of his chilling purpose. The next 10 yards were the worst, a stretch of ground where the trees thinned and the cover was sparse. It felt like crossing a vast open plain under a merciless sun. His instincts screamed at him to rush, to close the distance quickly, but he knew that speed was his enemy. Speed meant noise, and noise meant a bullet in the back. He saw a thorny patch of wild raspberry bushes directly in his path. The thought of crawling through them, of the thorns tearing at his already tattered clothes and skin, made him flinch. He made a split-second decision, veering slightly to the left, adding precious yards to his journey, but avoiding the certain noise and pain of the thorny barrier. It was a choice born of a hunter's logic, a small, calculated maneuver in a desperate, uncalculated war. Each foot gained felt like a monumental victory, a tiny triumph of will over terror. Suddenly, the forest exploded with sound. A red squirrel perched on a pine branch directly above his path let out a furious, chattering cry, a sharp, scolding noise that seemed to rip through the quiet afternoon air. Nathaniel froze instantly, his body going rigid, his face pressed into the dirt. He was certain he was discovered. His heart hammered against his ribs so violently he thought it might break through. He waited, not breathing, for the sound of footsteps, for a harsh voice to call out. The seconds stretched into an eternity, each one a lifetime of pure, undiluted fear. But the voices in the clearing never changed their cadence. Jedediah laughed at something Silas said. The squirrel, its territorial dispute apparently won, fell silent and scurried higher into the tree. It was a moment of pure, dumb luck, a small, unearned miracle that left him shaking with relief. He was close now, so close he could smell the horses. It was a familiar scent from the stables in Helena, a mixture of sweat, hay, and leather that cut through the smell of the pines. The two animals were tethered to a low branch, shifting nervously, their ears twitching as they sensed his approach. One of them, a big roan with a white blaze, stomped its hoof, the sound a dull thud against the soft earth. The noise sent another jolt of panic through Nathaniel, but it was quickly followed by a surge of adrenaline. The rifle was there. He could see it now, hanging from the horn of the roan's saddle, its dark wood and blued steel a stark and terrible promise of power. It was real. This impossible, suicidal plan was becoming real with every silent foot he crawled. The final yards felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly short. His fingers, trembling and caked with dirt, finally brushed against the worn leather of the saddlebag. The contact was like an electric shock, grounding him in the terrifying reality of the moment. He reached up, his hand closing around the stock of the Winchester. The wood was smooth and cool beneath his palm, but the weight of the weapon was staggering. It was heavier than he remembered from his father's lessons, a dead, unyielding burden. For a moment he thought he wouldn't be able to lift it, that his thin, underfed arms would fail him. He took another shaky breath, gripped the rifle with both hands, and began the awkward process of trying to lift it free from the saddle horn without making a sound. The horse shifted again, its warm breath ghosting over his neck, and he froze, his heart in his throat. The rifle wouldn't budge at first. Its weight settled awkwardly in the curve of the saddle horn. He had to pull, his muscles straining, his teeth gritted. His hands were shaking so violently that he felt a sickening lack of control, as if his own body were betraying him. The weapon finally came loose with a soft metallic clink as the trigger guard brushed against a brass stirrup. The sound, though quiet, was as loud as a gunshot in his oversensitized ears. He froze again, listening, his entire being focused on the clearing. He heard nothing but the wind and the distant, indifferent voices. He had not been heard. Cradling the heavy rifle against his chest, he began the slow, painful process of backing away, retreating into the deeper shadows of the forest to prepare for the next, even more impossible part of his plan. As he held the cold, heavy steel against his body, a memory surfaced, sharp and vivid. He saw his father's hands, not the thin, trembling hands of a boy, but the large, calloused and utterly confident hands of a man who knew his tools. He remembered the easy, practiced way Ezekiel would clean this very type of rifle by the firelight, the sure and steady motion as he oiled the mechanism, the respect he had for the weapon, not as an instrument of violence but as a provider and a protector. The memory did not erase the fear, but it gave it shape. It reminded him that this was not a foreign object, but a part of his heritage, a tool he had been taught to understand. He was his father's son, and this was his father's work. The thought was a sliver of steel in his spine, a fragile resolve taking root amidst the terror. Almost on autopilot, his thumb found the hammer, his fingers tracing the familiar lines of the receiver. It was a motion he had practiced 1,000 times with his father, a muscle memory buried deep beneath 3 years of scavenging and hiding. He carefully, silently, pulled the hammer back just enough to check the loading gate. He didn't need to see it, he could feel it. There was a cartridge in the chamber, the smooth brass casing a solid, deadly confirmation. The rifle was loaded. This small, mechanical act, this one moment of practiced competence in a whirlwind of chaos and fear, was a powerful anchor. It was proof that he could do this, that his father's lessons had not been in vain. He was no longer just a terrified boy. He was a terrified boy with a loaded weapon and a clear, terrible purpose. The journey back to the edge of the clearing was a different kind of ordeal. He couldn't crawl while carrying the long rifle. He had to move in a low crouch, the weapon held in both hands, its weight throwing him off balance. The forest, which had been his shield, now seemed a maze of obstacles. Branches snagged at his clothes and roots threatened to trip him at every step. He felt a wave of disorientation, his focus split between the heavy burden in his arms and the path ahead. For a terrifying moment, he wasn't sure which way he was facing, the trees all looking the same, the light uniform and confusing. He stopped, squeezing his eyes shut, and focused on the sound of the voices, using them as a compass to reorient himself in the disorienting woods. He didn't return to the fallen log. His hunter's instincts, awakened and sharp, told him to find a new position, one they wouldn't expect. He spotted it a few yards to the left of his original hiding place, a massive ponderosa pine, its trunk wide enough to conceal his entire body. It offered a clearer view of the clearing and, more importantly, a solid rest for the rifle's long barrel. He slipped behind the tree, its rough bark pressing into his back. He carefully rested the Winchester on a low, thick branch, the wood supporting the weapon's weight and steadying his trembling arms. The simple act of stabilizing the rifle calmed the shaking in his hands, allowing him to focus, to breathe, to prepare for what he had to do next. Peering cautiously around the side of the massive tree trunk, he saw that the terrible tableau remained unchanged. Jedediah Taggart had his back turned, taking a long drink from a water skin. Silas stood over the grave, shovel in hand, still hesitating, his posture a study in nervous reluctance. And in the shallow pit, Caroline Ashford lay still, her eyes closed, as if she had already accepted her fate. A wave of profound, sickening relief washed over Nathaniel. He had made it. He had crossed the open ground, stolen the weapon, and positioned himself without being detected. The first impossible part of his plan was complete. The relief was fleeting, however, because he knew the truth. The crawl through the woods was not the end. It was the beginning. He was no longer a witness. He was a participant. The silence that descended upon the clearing was heavier and more terrifying than the shouting had been. It was a vacuum, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the pines and the ragged, desperate sound of two people breathing. The adrenaline that had turned Nathaniel's arms to steel and his voice to iron was now draining away, leaving behind a deep, bone-aching exhaustion and a tremor he couldn't control. The Winchester rifle felt impossibly heavy, its weight pulling his tired shoulders toward the earth. He looked at Caroline Ashford, who was now sitting on the edge of the shallow grave, her body racked with silent, convulsive sobs. The immediate danger was gone, but the forest, which had been a witness, now felt like a cage. They were miles from anywhere, two vulnerable figures in a vast, indifferent wilderness that had almost swallowed one of them whole. He knew, with the chilling certainty of a survivor, that they could not stay here. The Taggarts were gone, but they might come back. He forced his numb legs to move, his mind sharpened by 3 years of constant threat assessment, already working on the next problem. Survival was a chain of solved problems, and the current one was shelter. He couldn't risk a fire in the open, not with the Taggarts potentially circling back. He had to find a place to hide, a place to wait for the sun to rise. As he helped Caroline to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her, a fragment of a memory surfaced, unbidden and strange. It was his father's voice, years ago, pointing toward a ridge. "See those 3 sisters, Nate? 3 big rocks all in a line. A man can always find his way if he knows the landmarks." He had no idea why that specific memory chose this moment to appear, but it felt like a compass point, materializing in the chaos of his mind. He took Caroline's arm, his touch surprisingly steady, and with the heavy rifle cradled in his other arm, he led her away from the scene of her near death, walking toward the 3 stone sisters of his father's memory. Their progress was painfully slow, a stumbling, halting journey through the darkening woods. Caroline was in a state of shock, moving mechanically, her eyes vacant and fixed on the ground in front of her. Nathaniel, though physically drained, was hyper-alert, his senses screaming with a heightened awareness that bordered on pain. Every rustle of leaves was the sound of a returning Taggart, every shadow a potential ambush. The setting sun cast long, distorted fingers of darkness through the trees, turning the familiar forest into a menacing labyrinth. The weight of the rifle was a constant, agonizing burden, its cold steel a reminder of the violence he had just committed to, a line he had crossed from which there was no return. He was no longer just a boy hiding from the world. He was a boy who had aimed a loaded gun at a man's chest, and the gravity of that act was settling upon him like a shroud. After what felt like an eternity of walking, he saw them. Silhouetted against the last vestiges of the evening sky were 3 massive granite boulders, huddled together on a low rise like a council of ancient giants. It was the landmark from his father's memory, exactly as he had described it. A strange feeling washed over him, not quite recognition, but a deep instinctual sense of rightness, as if he were being guided by a hand he could not see. He left Caroline to rest at the base of the smallest rock and began to circle the formation, his own hands tracing the cold, rough texture of the stone. He was looking for a crevice, a small cave, any natural indentation that could offer them protection from the wind and the night. He was operating on his father's lessons, the ingrained knowledge of a woodsman that had been buried under 3 years of urban survival, now rising to the surface when he needed it most. He found it behind the largest of the 3 boulders, so perfectly concealed he almost missed it. It was a low door, no more than 4 feet high, built of weathered, silvered planks and almost completely overgrown with moss and creeping ivy. It was set deep into the hillside, a man-made entrance to a natural shelter, a dugout carved from the earth itself. The handle was a simple loop of cured leather, and the latch a thick piece of wood that swiveled on an iron pin. It was the kind of hidden refuge a prospector might build to store supplies or to wait out the harsh Montana winters, a secret place known only to its creator. For a boy who had spent 3 years sleeping in barns and alleys, the sight of that small hidden door was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. It was a promise of safety, a shield against the vast, dark world. Pushing the heavy wooden latch aside, he pulled the door open. It swung inward with a low groan of protest, releasing a wave of cool, still air that smelled of damp earth, dried pine, and something else, something deeply and achingly familiar, the faint, ghostly scent of his father's pipe tobacco. The smell hit him with such force it made him gasp. A sensory memory so powerful it was like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He helped Caroline inside, then pulled the heavy door shut behind them. The world outside vanished. The whispering wind, the rustling leaves, the looming shadows, it was all gone. Replaced by an absolute profound silence and a darkness so complete, it was almost a physical substance. For the first time since he had heard the Taggarts' voices, the frantic, terrified knot in his stomach began to unclench. This darkness was not threatening. It was a blanket. It was safety. His fumbling hands found what he was looking for almost immediately. A small square tinderbox and a whale oil lantern sitting on a rough-hewn table, exactly where a practical man would leave them. His fingers, though still trembling, worked the flint and steel with practiced ease. A spark caught, and a moment later, a small, steady flame bloomed to life within the lantern's glass chimney. He raised the light, its warm golden glow pushing back the oppressive darkness and revealing the secrets of the small space. It was a single room no bigger than a large closet, but it was a marvel of efficient design. A narrow cot was built into the earthen wall, a thick wool blanket folded neatly at its foot. Against the far wall stood a small pot-bellied stove, and beside it, shelves were carved directly into the dirt, stocked with tins of beans, sacks of flour, and jars of dried meat. It was a perfectly preserved haven, a time capsule of survival. Caroline, letting out a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire day, sagged onto the cot, her body finally succumbing to the exhaustion and shock. Nathaniel found a sealed canteen of water on the shelf and handed it to her, his movements slow and methodical. He felt a strange sense of calm settle over him, a feeling of profound and quiet belonging he had not known since the day his father walked into the mountains. This place was more than just a shelter. It was an echo. Every object, from the neatly stacked firewood to the worn handle of the cast-iron skillet, felt like it bore the imprint of his father's hands. He was standing in a room that Ezekiel Holloway had built, a secret part of his father's life he had never known existed, and the feeling was both heartbreaking and deeply comforting. He was home, in a way he had not been for 3 long, lonely years. His gaze fell upon a small, sturdy wooden chest tucked at the foot of the cot, its lid closed and secured with a simple leather strap. Thinking it might hold another blanket for Caroline, he knelt down and unfastened the strap, lifting the heavy lid. The scent of gun oil and old leather rose to meet him. The chest was filled with the tools of a prospector's life, spare ammunition for a Winchester, coils of rope, a set of small specialized digging tools, and a worn leather pouch that clinked with the sound of rock samples. But resting on top of it all, placed there with obvious care, was a slim leather-bound volume. It was a journal, its cover worn smooth from use. His breath hitched in his throat. He didn't need to see the name to know whose it was. He recognized the book itself, the one his father always carried, the one he wrote in every night by the fire. With hands that shook so badly he could barely control them, Nathaniel lifted the journal from the chest. It felt heavier than the rifle, freighted with the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions and 3 years of crushing silence. He sank to the dirt floor, crossing his legs and pulling the lantern closer, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls. The room felt impossibly still, as if holding its breath. He opened the book, his fingers tracing the familiar, neat cursive of his father's hand. He flipped past entries detailing gold finds, weather patterns, and sketches of the mountains, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was looking for the end, for the last page, for the final word. He found it. The last entry was dated just 2 days after his father had supposedly vanished into the mountains forever. He began to read, his eyes flying across the page, his mind struggling to comprehend the words that were rearranging his entire world. This was not a diary of a man who was lost. It was not a goodbye from a man who had met with an accident. It was a letter to him. It spoke of a debt, of dangerous men from his father's past, and of a threat so severe that the only way to protect his son was to disappear, to stage his own vanishing to draw the danger away. This hidden shelter, the supplies, the rifle his father had taught him to use, it was all part of a desperate, last-ditch plan. A plan for Nathaniel's survival. A wave of understanding so immense and powerful crashed over him, and the carefully constructed wall he had built around his heart for 3 years shattered into a million pieces. The first sob escaped him, a raw, ragged sound torn from the deepest part of his soul. The tears that streamed down his dirt-streaked face were not the tears of a boy mourning a father he had lost. They were the tears of a son who had just found him again. They were tears of grief for the years of loneliness, but also tears of a shattering, overwhelming gratitude for a love so fierce it had reached across time and silence to protect him. He clutched the journal to his chest, his small body racked with sobs that shook the tiny hidden room. He had thought he was forgotten, an insignificant ghost haunting the edges of the world. He had believed his father had left him. But in this small earthen womb he had discovered the truth. He had never been abandoned. He had been protected. He had been loved, with a foresight and a ferocity he was only now beginning to comprehend. He was not an orphan left to chance. He was a son with a legacy, a hidden inheritance of love and survival. The news of the rescue traveled faster than a prairie fire, carried by stagecoach drivers and telegraph wires, until the names Nathaniel Holloway and Caroline Ashford were spoken in every saloon and general store from Helena to Virginia City. The Taggart brothers, run to ground by a posse a week later, were a footnote to the more incredible story. The starving orphan who faced down two notorious killers with their own rifle. Nathaniel was no longer an invisible shadow in the back alleys of the capital. He was a legend, a curiosity. But to him, the whispers and stares felt unreal, a story about someone else. The only thing that felt real was the summons he received 2 weeks later, a crisp envelope delivered by a man in a clean suit, requesting his presence at the home of federal judge Theodore Ashford. The walk to the judge's house on the hill felt longer and more terrifying than the crawl through the forest, because this was a confrontation not with monsters, but with a world he had never been allowed to enter. He stood in the judge's study, a room that smelled of leather-bound books, beeswax, and a wealth he could barely comprehend. He was acutely aware of his own smallness, of the worn fabric of his trousers and the dirt that seemed permanently etched into the lines of his hands. Judge Ashford was a tall, silver-haired man with eyes that held a profound and weary sadness, a sadness that seemed to deepen as he looked at Nathaniel. He spoke of his gratitude, his voice thick with an emotion that was clearly genuine, and he explained what Nathaniel had done. He had not just saved a life, he had restored the judge's entire world. And then he gestured to a heavy leather satchel on his large mahogany desk, the kind used by banks to transport gold dust and currency. The judge explained that it contained a reward, a sum of money so vast it would ensure Nathaniel never had to scavenge or sleep in a stable again. For a single dizzying moment, Nathaniel saw his future unfurl before him. He saw a life of warmth, of full meals, of shoes without holes. He saw an end to the gnawing hunger, an end to the constant grinding fear of the coming winter. The money was a physical solution to every problem that had defined his existence for 3 long, brutal years. It was safety. It was survival made easy. It was everything the pragmatic, starving part of him screamed to accept. All he had to do was reach out and take the bag. He could feel the phantom ache of hunger in his belly, the memory of cold seeping into his bones, the instinct for self-preservation, honed to a razor's edge over 1,000 lonely nights, urged him to say yes, to take what was offered and secure his own meager life in this indifferent world. But then another memory rose, unbidden but powerful, silencing the clamor of his own need. He was back in the small cabin, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. His father's voice a low, steady presence in the room. Ezekiel Holloway was cleaning his rifle, his movements sure and practiced, as he spoke of the things that truly mattered. "Gold can be lost, land can be taken," his father had said, his eyes meeting Nathaniel's with a burning intensity. "But what you are on the inside, Nate, a man's character, that's the only thing he truly owns. It's the only currency that matters in the end." The memory was so vivid, he could almost smell the gun oil and the pine smoke. It was the bedrock of his entire being, the last, most precious inheritance he had received from the man he had lost. He looked from the bag of money to the judge's tired, grieving eyes, and he knew what he had to do. The choice was not between poverty and wealth. It was between who he had been forced to become to survive and the man his father had raised him to be. Taking that money would feel like selling the very principle he had risked his life for. It would be a betrayal of the ghost that had stood with him in that clearing. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady, the reedy uncertainty of his childhood finally giving way to a new, hard-won firmness. He told the judge that he could not accept the reward. He explained in simple, unadorned words that he had not done it for money. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. It was what his father would have done. A profound silence descended upon the room, broken only by the ticking of a grand clock on the mantelpiece. Judge Ashford stared at Nathaniel, his expression unreadable at first. The judge's face seemed to crumble, the stern lines of authority giving way to a wave of raw, unguarded grief. He sank back into his large leather chair, his shoulders slumping as if under an immense weight. He confessed that he too had a son, a boy named Thomas, who had been lost to a fever years ago. He had tried to instill in Thomas the same values, the same sense of honor and duty. In Nathaniel's simple, unwavering refusal of the reward, the judge had not heard the words of a destitute orphan. He had heard the echo of his own lost son, a phantom voice speaking of character and principle from across the veil of death. In that moment, the true revelation washed over Nathaniel. It was not a discovery of gold or a hidden secret, but a realization that was far more precious. His father's legacy was not a vanished prospector's claim or a pouch of dust. It was this. It was the code of conduct that had been forged in him by a campfire's glow, a moral compass that had guided him through the darkest terror to do something decent, something good. He had spent 3 years believing he was just a survivor, a forgotten remnant of a broken family. But the judge's reaction, the raw emotion in the older man's eyes, showed him the truth. He was not just a survivor. He was Ezekiel Holloway's son, and his father's teachings were not dead memories, but a living, powerful force in the world, strong enough to save a life and mend a broken heart. He understood then that his father had never truly left him. Ezekiel Holloway was present in the way Nathaniel had assessed the clearing, in the steady hands that had chambered around, and most of all, in the voice that had chosen character over survival. For 3 years, he had been haunted by the silence his father left behind. Now in this opulent room, surrounded by the trappings of a world he never knew, he finally understood. The lessons were the proof of love. The principles were the inheritance. His father had given him the only tools that could have possibly navigated him through that impossible moment in the forest. He had not been abandoned to the wilderness. He had been perfectly equipped for it, armed not just with knowledge of tracking and shooting, but with an unshakable sense of right and wrong. A feeling of peace so deep and profound it felt like the settling of the very earth beneath him filled the empty spaces inside Nathaniel. The gnawing loneliness, the bitter resentment of being left behind, it all dissolved in the warmth of this understanding. He had not been forgotten by the world. He had simply been carrying his father's light in a place so dark he couldn't see it himself. The judge's recognition was the mirror he needed to finally see the truth. He looked at the judge, a man broken by a loss he understood all too well, and saw not a powerful official, but another person who had been guided by the memory of someone they loved. They were 2 solitary figures, connected by the ghosts of a good father and a good son. The judge, his voice hoarse with emotion, made a different offer, not of money but of a home. He spoke of an empty room in the house, of a life that included an education, of a future. It was not an offer of charity, but an invitation to build a new family from the wreckage of 2 broken ones. In that moment, Nathaniel knew that his long, solitary journey was over. He had walked out of the mountains 3 years ago, a boy searching for a place in a world that didn't want him. He had found it not in the bustling streets of Helena or at the bottom of a gold pan, but in a moment of impossible courage, by holding fast to the only true thing he had ever owned: his father's love, disguised as a lesson. The adoption was formalized before the first snows of winter fell. The boy who had learned to be invisible, to make himself small enough to slip through the cracks of the world, was now Nathaniel Ashford, son of a federal judge. The transition was jarring, a movement between 2 worlds that could not have been more different. He traded the cold floor of a stable for a warm bed with clean sheets, the gnawing uncertainty of his next meal for 3 full plates a day at a polished dining table. The silence of his new life was not the oppressive, lonely silence of the wilderness, but a quiet, peaceful stillness, filled with the scent of old books and the promise of a future. It was a world of structure and safety. The very things he had lost 3 years ago now returned to him in a way he could never have imagined. He did not forget the boy he had been. He couldn't. Some nights, he would wake with a start, the phantom feeling of cold seeping into his bones, his ears straining for the sound of danger. But then he would see the moonlight filtering through a real glass window, feel the weight of a thick wool blanket, and the fear would slowly recede. He began to study, his mind, once focused solely on the calculus of survival, now proving to be sharp and inquisitive. He devoured books on history, philosophy, and most voraciously, the law. He saw the law not as a set of abstract rules, but as a framework for character, a way to codify the very principles his father had lived and died by. It was a way to make the roads safer, to ensure that no other child would have to face the kind of monsters he had. He found a new purpose, a clear and unwavering mission that grew from the ashes of his past. He would not be a prospector, forever searching for a vein of color in the cold, hard rock. He would be a protector. He would dedicate his life to upholding the justice that had been so absent during his lost years. He set his sights on becoming one of Montana's first U.S. Marshals, a figure who could stand in the clearings of the world and ensure that the vulnerable were not left to the mercy of men like the Taggarts. His father had taught him what it meant to be a man of character. Judge Ashford was now giving him the tools to be a man of action, to turn that internal code into an external shield for others. Years later, as a man grown, he would marry and have 4 children of his own. He would teach them by the firelight, just as his own father had taught him, speaking not of gold or land, but of courage, honor, and the quiet duty to do what is right, especially when it is hard. He finally understood what his father had been searching for in those mountains. The mother lode, the great and final treasure, was never a seam of gold. It was this. It was the warmth of a home, the laughter of his children, the steadfast love of a family. It was the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with purpose, a life that honored the ghosts of the past by building a better, safer future. He never lost the weary watchfulness in his eyes, the mark of a boy who had seen too much, too soon, but it was no longer shadowed by fear. It was now tempered with a quiet strength and a deep, abiding compassion. He knew, with a certainty that had been forged in terror and tempered by love, that true courage was not the absence of fear. He had been terrified in that forest clearing, his knees shaking and his heart threatening to burst from his chest. Courage, he had learned, was the choice to act in spite of that fear. It was the simple, profound, and life-altering decision to be the kind of man his father would be proud to call his son.